The Wall, one of the most impactful works by Jean-Paul Sartre, immerses us in the darkest side of human existence. In this story, Sartre confronts us face to face with absurdity, anguish, and the inevitability of death through the tale of a prisoner condemned to die at dawn. With his characteristic existentialism, Sartre explores how we react to the inevitable, stripping away illusions and forcing us to confront our own freedom in its rawest and most terrifying form. What would you do if you knew you had only one day to live? The Wall not only invites you to reflect on that question, but compels you to do so. They threw us into a large white room and my eyes blinked because the light hurt them. Then I saw a table and 4 men behind it, some civilians looking at papers. They had piled the other prisoners at the back, and we had to cross the entire room to join them. There were many I knew and others who must have been foreigners. The 2 in front of me were blonde with round heads. They looked French, I thought. The shorter one kept pulling up his pants. He was nervous. This lasted about 3 hours. I was dazed and had an empty head, but the room was well heated, which I found very pleasant. It had been 24 hours since we had stopped shivering. The guards brought the prisoners one after another before the table. The 4 men would then ask them their name and profession. Most of the time, they wouldn't go any further, or sometimes they would ask a random question. Did you participate in the sabotage of the ammunition? Or where were you and what were you doing in the morning? They didn't listen to the answer, or at least they seemed not to listen. They would fall silent for a moment, staring straight ahead and then start writing. They asked Tom if it was true that he served in the International Brigade. Tom couldn't say otherwise due to the papers they had found in his clothes. They didn't ask Juan anything, but as soon as he said his name, they wrote for a long time. "It's my brother Jose, the anarchist," said Juan. "You know he isn't here." "I'm not from any party. I've never done politics." They didn't respond. Juan said, "I haven't done anything yet. I don't want to pay for the others." His lips trembled. A guard silenced him and took him away. It was my turn. "You are called Pablo Ibieta." I said yes. The man looked at his papers and said, "Where is Ramon Gris?" "I don't know." "You hid him in your house from the 6th to the 19th. They wrote for a moment, and the guards made me leave the corridor. Tom and Juan were waiting between 2 guards. We started walking. Tom asked one of the guards, "And now what?" The guard replied, "This is an interrogation or a trial." "It's the trial," said the guard. "Well, what are you going to do with us?" The guard answered curtly, "The sentence will be communicated to you in the cell." In reality, what served us as a cell was one of the basements of the hospital. The cold was felt terribly because of the drafts. All night it had irritated us, and during the day we hadn't fared any better. The 5 days prior, I had been in a cell of the Archbishopric, a kind of underground that must date back to the Middle Ages. Since there were many prisoners and little space, they shoved us in anywhere. I didn't miss my cell. There I hadn't suffered from the cold, but I was alone, which in the long run is irritating. In the basement I had company. Juan hardly spoke, he was scared, and then he was too young to have anything to say. But Tom was a good conversationalist and knew Spanish very well. In the underground there was a bench and 4 mattresses. When we were returned, we gathered and waited in silence. Tom said after a moment, "We're exhausted." "I think so too," I said, "but I don't think they'll do anything to the kid." "They have nothing to reproach him for," said Tom. "He's the brother of a militant, that's all." I looked at Juan. He didn't seem to understand. Tom continued, "Do you know what they do in Zaragoza? They lay the guys in the road and run over them with trucks. A Moroccan deserter told us," he said. "They say it's to save ammunition." "That doesn't save gas," I said. I was irritated with Tom. He shouldn't have said that. "There are some officers who stroll along the road," he continued, "watching it with their hands in their pockets, smoking cigarettes. Do you think they finish off the guys? You're mistaken. They let them scream sometimes for an hour." The Moroccan said that the first time. He almost vomited. "I don't think they do that," I said, "unless they really lack ammunition." Light came through 4 vents and a round opening that had been made in the ceiling to the left, and it shone on the sky. It was through this round hole, generally covered with a trapdoor, that coal was unloaded in the basement. Just beneath the hole, there was a large pile of coal intended to heat the hospital, but since the beginning of the war the sick had been evacuated, and the coal had been left there useless. It rained on it occasionally because they had forgotten to close the trapdoor. Tom started shivering. "What's wrong?" I said. "Here we go again." He stood up and started exercising. With each movement, his shirt opened over his white, hairy chest. He lay on his back, lifted his legs and scissored them in the air. I watched his thick buttocks shake. Tom was broad but had too much fat. I thought that rifle bullets or bayonet tips would soon sink into that tender mass of flesh like into a piece of butter. This didn't have the same effect on me as if he had been thin. I wasn't exactly cold, but I couldn't feel my back or arms. Occasionally I had the impression that I was missing something and started looking for my jacket around. Then I suddenly remembered that they hadn't given me the jacket. It was very annoying. They had taken our suits to give them to their soldiers, and they had left us with nothing but our shirts and those cotton pants that hospitalized patients wear in the middle of summer. After a moment, Tom got up and sat down next to me, panting. "Have you warmed up?" "No, but I'm suffocating." Around 8 p.m., a commander entered with 2 phalangists. He had a sheet of paper in his hand. He asked the guard, "What are these 3 called?" "Steinbock, Ibieta and Mirbal," said the guard. The commander put on his glasses and looked at the list. "Steinbock, Steinbock, here you are. You are sentenced to death. You will be shot tomorrow morning." He looked again at the other 2. "You also," he said. "That's not possible," said one. "Not me." The commander looked at him with astonishment. "What's your name?" "Juan Mirbal." "Well, your name is here," said the commander. "You are sentenced." "I haven't done anything," said Juan. The commander shrugged and turned to Tom and me. "You are Basques?" "None of us is Basque." He took an irritated air. "I told you I would not waste time chasing them." "Then naturally you don't want a priest?" We didn't respond. "A Belgian doctor will come shortly. He is authorized to spend the night with you." He made a military salute and left. "What did I tell you?" exclaimed Tom. "We're done for." "Yes," I said. "It's stupid," said the kid, trying to be just, but I didn't like the kid. He had a face that was too fine, and fear and suffering had disfigured him. All his features had twisted. 3 days earlier, he had been a delicate-looking boy. That can be pleasing, but now he looked like an old hag, and I thought he would never be young again, even if they released him. It wouldn't have been bad to have a little pity to offer him. The piety disgusts me. It rather horrified me. I hadn't said anything else, but his face turned grey, and his hands were grey. He sat back down and stared at the floor with wide-open eyes. Tom was a good soul. He wanted to take him by the arm, but the little one violently pulled away, making a face. "Leave him," I said softly. "You see, he's going to start screaming." Tom obeyed reluctantly. He would have liked to comfort the boy, which would have occupied him, and he wouldn't have been tempted to think about himself. But that irritated me. I had never thought about death because I had never been faced with the occasion. But now the occasion was here and there was no way to avoid thinking about it. Tom began to speak. "Some guys have blown up," he asked me. I didn't answer. He started to explain that he had blown up 6 since the beginning of August. He didn't realize the situation, and I clearly saw that he didn't want to realize it. I myself still couldn't completely grasp it. He asked if it would hurt a lot. He thought about the bullets, imagining their fiery hail through my body. All this was outside the real question. I was calm. We had all night to understand. After a moment, Tom stopped talking and I glanced at him. I saw that he too had turned grey and had a miserable look. I said to myself, "Here we go." It was almost night. A soft light filtered through the vents, and the pile of coal formed a large dark patch under the sky. Through the hole in the ceiling, I could already see a star. The night would be clear and cold. The door opened and 2 guards entered, followed by a blond man in a light brown uniform. He greeted us. "I am a doctor," he said. "I have authorization to assist you in these painful circumstances." He had a pleasant and distinguished voice. I asked him, "What are you doing here?" "I am at your disposal. I will do everything possible to make these hours less heavy for you." "Why did you come with us?" "There are other guys. The hospital is full." "They sent me here," he replied vaguely. "Ah, would you like to smoke?" he added hastily. "I have cigarettes and even cigars." He offered us English cigarettes and some cigars, but we refused. I looked him in the eyes and he seemed annoyed. I said to him, "You didn't come here out of compassion. Besides, I know you. I saw you with some fascists in the barracks yard the day I was arrested." I was going to continue, but suddenly something surprised me. The presence of this doctor abruptly ceased to interest me. Generally, when I confront a man, I don't let go. Yet I lost the desire to speak. I shrugged and looked at Gonzalez. He raised his head and watched me with curiosity. The guards had sat down on a mattress. Pedro, tall and thin, turned his thumbs, while the other occasionally shook his head to avoid falling asleep. "Do you want light?" Pedro suddenly asked the doctor. The other nodded. I thought he had no more intelligence than a log, but surely he wasn't cruel. Looking at his large, blue, cold eyes, I felt he sinned mainly for lack of imagination. Pedro left and returned with a lamp that he placed in a corner of the bench. It illuminated poorly, but was better than nothing. The night before, they had left us in the dark. I stared for a long time at the circle of light that the lamp cast on the ceiling. I was fascinated. Then abruptly I woke up. The circle of light vanished and I felt crushed under an enormous fist. It wasn't the thought of death or fear, it was the anonymity. My cheekbones burned and my skull ached. I shook myself and looked at my two companions. Tom had his head buried in his hands. I could only see his thick white neck. The little Juan was, by the way, the one in the worst condition. His mouth was open and his nose trembled. The doctor approached him and placed his hand on his shoulder as if to comfort him, but his eyes remained cold. Then I saw the Belgian's hand secretly slide down Juan's arm to his wrist. Juan let it happen with indifference. The Belgian took his wrist with 3 fingers in a distracted manner. At the same time, he stepped back a bit and managed to turn his back to me. But I leaned back and saw him take out his watch and look at it for a moment, without releasing the boy's wrist. After a moment, he let the limp hand fall and leaned against the wall. Then, as if suddenly remembering something very important that needed to be noted immediately, he took a notebook from his pocket and wrote a few lines in it. "The pig," I thought angrily. "If he comes to take my pulse, I will shove my fist in his filthy mouth." But he didn't come, yet I felt he was watching me. He said with an impersonal voice, "Don't you think it's cold here?" He seemed to be cold. He was pale. "I'm not cold," I replied. He kept looking at me with a hard stare. I suddenly understood and brought my hands to my face. I was drenched in sweat in that basement, in the middle of winter, in a full draft. I was sweating. I ran my hands through my hair, which was covered in perspiration, simultaneously realizing that my shirt was damp and stuck to my skin. I had been dripping sweat for at least an hour and hadn't felt anything. But that had not escaped the filthy Belgian. He had seen the drops rolling down my cheeks and thought it was the manifestation of a nearly pathological state of terror. And he felt normal and proud of being so because he was cold. I wanted to get up and go break his face, but just as I made a move, my shame and anger disappeared. I fell back onto the bench indifferently. I contented myself with rubbing my neck with my handkerchief because I now felt the sweat dripping from my hair onto my neck, and it was unpleasant. Besides, I soon gave up rubbing. It was useless. My handkerchief was already damp enough to twist it, and I continued sweating. I was sweating even on my buttocks, and my damp pants stuck to the bench. Suddenly, little Juan spoke. "Are you a doctor?" "Yes," the Belgian said. "Do you suffer a long time?" "Oh, none of that," he said in a paternal voice. "It ends quickly." He had the air of soothing a patient in a clinic, but I was told that sometimes 2 shots are needed. "Sometimes," said the Belgian, lowering his head. "It may happen that the first shot does not hit any vital organs, so it's necessary for them to reload the rifles and aim again." He reflected and added in a hoarse voice, "That takes time." I had an awful fear of suffering. I thought only of that, typical of his age. I didn't think much about it, and it wasn't the fear of suffering that made me sweat. I got up and walked to the pile of coal. Tom jumped and shot me a resentful look. He was irritated because my shoes squeaked. I wondered if my face was as earthy as his. I saw that he was sweating too. He looked splendid. No light slipped into that gloomy corner, and I only had to lift my head to see the Big Dipper, but it was no longer like before. The night before, in my cell at the Archbishopric, I could see a large piece of sky, and each hour of the day brought me a different memory. In the morning, when the sky was a hard, light blue, I thought of some beaches along the Atlantic coast. At noon, I saw the sun and remembered a bar in Seville where I drank manzanilla while eating anchovies and olives. At noon, I would sit in the shade and think of the deep shadow that stretches in the middle of the sands, while the other half sparkles in the sun. It was truly painful to see all of Earth reflected like that in the sky. But now I could look up as much as I wanted, and the sky evoked nothing for me. I preferred this. I sat back down near Tom. A long time passed. Tom began to speak in a low voice. He always needed to talk. Without it, he wouldn't recognize his thoughts. I think he was addressing me, but he didn't look at me. He was probably afraid to see me. As I was grey and sweaty, we were similar and worse than mirrors to each other. I looked at the Belgian, the living one, you understand? I said, "As for me, I don't understand." I also began to speak in a low voice. I looked at the Belgian. What is going to happen to us? I can't comprehend it. There was a terrible smell around Tom. I felt I was more sensitive to smells than before. I said ironically, "You will understand in a moment." "This isn't clear," he said obstinately. "I want to be brave, but I need to know at least. Listen, they're going to take us to the yard. The guys are going to line up in front of us. How many will there be?" "I don't know, 5 or 8 at most." "Come on, it'll be 8. They'll shout, 'Aim,' and I'll see the 8 rifles aimed at me. I think I'll want to throw myself against the wall, push the wall with my back with all my strength, and the wall will hold like in nightmares. I can imagine all this. Oh, if you only knew how I can imagine it." "Come on," I said. "I can imagine it too. That must cause a hell of a pain. You know they shoot for the eyes and mouth to disfigure," he added maliciously. "I've been feeling the wounds for an hour now. I feel pain in my head and neck, not real pain. It's worse. They're the pains I'll feel tomorrow morning." But then I understood very well what he meant to say, but I didn't want to show it. As for the pains, I also carried them in my body like a multitude of little knife stabs. I couldn't do anything, but being like him, I didn't give it importance. Then I said roughly, "Swallow your tongue." He started talking to himself, never taking his eyes off the Belgian, who didn't seem to listen. I knew what he had come to do. What we thought didn't interest him. He had come to look at our bodies, bodies that were agonizing in perfect health. "It's like in nightmares," Tom said. "You can think of anything. You always have the impression that it's like that you're going to understand, and then it slips away. It escapes and falls back. I tell myself afterward that there's nothing more, but I don't understand what I want to say. There are moments when I almost reach it, and then I fall back again. I start thinking about the pains, the bullets, the detonations. I'm a materialist, I swear I'm not crazy, but there's something that doesn't work. I see my corpse. That's not hard. But it's not me who sees it with my eyes. I have to think that I will see nothing more, that I will hear nothing more, and that the world will continue for others. We are not made to think about that, Pablo. You can believe me. It has already happened to me to keep vigil all night waiting for something. But this is unlike anything. This will catch us by the back, Pablo, and we will not have been able to prepare for it." "Courage," I said. "Do you want me to call a confessor?" "No," he replied. I had already noticed that he tended to prophesy and called me Pablo while speaking in a pale voice. I didn't like that much, but it seemed that all the Irish were like that. I had the vague impression that I smelled of urine. Deep down, I didn't have much sympathy for Tom, and I didn't see why I should feel it just because we were going to die together. There were some guys with whom it would have been different, like Ramon, for example. But between Tom and Juan, I felt alone. Besides, I preferred this. With Ramon, I might have become tender-hearted, but I felt terribly hard at that moment and wanted to remain hard. He continued chewing on words with a kind of distraction, surely speaking to prevent himself from thinking. He smelled strongly of urine, like old prosthetics. Naturally, he agreed with everything I said. I could have said it too. It's not natural to die. Since I was going to die, nothing seemed natural to me. Not that pile of coal, nor the bench, nor Pedro's filthy mouth. I only disliked thinking the same things as Tom, and I knew well that all night, in 5 minutes, I would continue thinking the same things while sweating and trembling at the same time. I looked at him sideways, and for the first time he seemed unfamiliar. He had death on his face. I was wounded in my pride. For 24 hours, I had lived beside Tom, listened to him, spoken to him, and I knew we had nothing in common. And now we resembled each other like 2 twin brothers, simply because we were going to blow up together. Tom took my hand without looking at me. "Pablo," he asked, "I wonder if it's true that one gets annihilated." I released my hand and said, "Look, there's a puddle between your filthy feet." There was a puddle at his feet, and some drops were falling from his pants. "What is that?" he said, distressed. "You're pissing in your underwear." "That's not true," he said furiously. "I'm not pissing. I don't feel anything." The Belgian approached and asked with false solicitude, "Are you feeling unwell, Tom?" Tom didn't respond. The Belgian looked at the puddle without saying anything. "I don't know what that is," Tom said in a surly tone, "but I'm not afraid. I swear I'm not afraid." The Belgian didn't answer. Tom got up and went to urinate in a corner, then returned buttoning his fly, sat down and didn't say a word. The Belgian took some notes. The three of us looked at him because he was alive. He had the gestures of a living person, the concerns of a living person. He trembled in that basement like the living should tremble. He had a well-nourished body that obeyed him. We hardly felt our bodies, in any case, not in the same way. I wanted to feel my pants between my legs, but I didn't dare. I looked at the Belgian, hunched over his legs, master of his muscles and able to think about tomorrow. We were there, three shadows deprived of blood, looking at him. Chupa eventually approached little Juan, wanting to feel the back of his neck for some professional reason, or perhaps obeying a charitable impulse. If he acted out of charity, it was the only time he did so that entire night. He caressed the skull and neck of little Juan. The boy let him do it without taking his eyes off him. Then suddenly he took the Belgian's hand and looked at it strangely, holding the Belgian's thick hand between his two, and those two grey pincers gripping that thick, reddish hand were not pleasant at all. I suspected what was going to happen, and Tom must have suspected it too, but the Belgian suspected nothing and smiled paternalistically. After a while, the boy brought the thick, chunky limb to his mouth and wanted to bite it. The Belgian pulled away sharply and retreated to the wall, hesitating. He looked at us with horror for a second, and suddenly he must have realized that we weren't men like him. I burst out laughing, and one of the guards startled. The other had fallen asleep. His wide-open eyes were white. I felt both tired and overexcited. I didn't want to think any more about what would happen at dawn, about death. It didn't fit with anything. I could only find a few words and emptiness, but as soon as I tried to think of something else, I saw rifles aimed at me, perhaps 20 times in a row. I lived my execution until once I thought it was real. I fell asleep for a minute. They were taking me to the wall, and I struggled, asking them for forgiveness. I woke up with a start and looked at the Belgian. I feared I had screamed during my sleep, but he was smoothing his moustache, noticing nothing. If he had wanted to, I think he could have slept for a moment. It had been 48 hours since I had kept vigil. I was exhausted, but I didn't want to lose those hours of life. They would come to wake me at dawn, and I would remain dazed with sleep and burst without making a sound. I didn't want that. I didn't want to die like a beast. I wanted to understand. I was also afraid of suffering nightmares. I got up, began to pace back and forth, and to change my mind, I started thinking about my past life. A multitude of memories rushed to me, a mix of good and bad, or at least that's how I called them. Before, there were faces and stories. I saw again the face of a young bullfighter who had been gored in Valencia, that of one of my uncles, and that of Ramon Gris. I remembered some stories, how I had been unemployed for 3 months in 1926, how I had almost starved to death. I recalled a night I spent on a bench in Granada. I hadn't eaten for 3 days and was furious. I didn't want to die, which made me smile at the violence with which I pursued happiness, women, freedom. Why did I want to liberate Spain? I admired Pi and Margall. I had joined the anarchist movement. I took everything seriously, as if I were immortal. At that moment, I had the impression that I had my whole life ahead of me, and I thought, it's a lie. It was worth nothing since it was ending. I wondered how I had been able to stroll, have fun with the girls. I wouldn't have lifted a finger to imagine I would die like this. My life lay before me, finished, closed like a sack, and yet everything in it was unfinished. I tried for a moment to judge it. I would have liked to tell myself it's a beautiful life, but it was impossible to pass judgment on it. It was just a sketch. I had wasted my time sketching some features for eternity. I hadn't understood anything, and I hardly regretted it. There were plenty of things I could have missed. The taste of chamomile or the baths I took in the summer in a small cove near Cadiz. But death stripped everything of its charm. Suddenly, the Belgian had a great idea. "My friends," he said, "I can arrange for the military administration to send a word, a message to the people you wish. Tom grunted. "I have no one." I didn't say anything. Tom waited a moment, then asked me with curiosity, "Don't you have anything to say to Concha?" I detested that tender complicity. It was my fault. The night before I had spoken of Concha. I should have held back. I had been with her for a year. The night before I would have chopped off an arm to see her for 5 minutes. That's why I spoke of her. It was stronger than me. Now, I didn't want to see her again. I had nothing more to say to her. I wouldn't even have wanted to embrace her. My body horrified me because it had turned grey and was sweating, and I wasn't sure I didn't also have horror of hers when she learned of my death. Concha would cry for a few months. She wouldn't feel any joy in life. But in any case, it was I who was going to die. I thought of her beautiful, tender eyes when she looked at me. Something passed from her to me. I thought that was over. If she looked at me now, her gaze would remain in her eyes. It wouldn't reach me. I was alone. Tom was also alone, but not in the same way. He had sat astride and was looking at the bench with a kind of smile. He seemed amazed. He reached out his hand and touched the wood cautiously, as if he feared breaking something. He immediately withdrew his hand and shuddered. If it had been Tom, I wouldn't have dared to touch the bench. It was still Irish comedy, but I also found that the objects had a strange air. They were more blurred, less dense than usual. Just looking at the bench, the lamp, the pile of coal was enough to feel that I was going to die. Naturally, I couldn't think clearly about my death, but I saw it everywhere. In things, in the way things had receded and kept their distance discreetly, like people who speak softly at the bedside of a dying person. It was his death that Tom had just touched on the bench. In the state I was in, if someone had come to announce that I could return home quietly, that I was allowed to save my life, that would have left me cold. I had no one left. In a certain sense, I was calm, but it was a horrible calm because of my body. My body. I saw with its eyes, listened with its ears, but it wasn't mine. It was sweating and trembling alone, and I didn't recognize it. I was forced to touch it and look at it to know what it was doing, as if it was someone else's body. For moments I still felt it. I felt some sliding, some sort of turns like when an airplane goes into a dive, or I felt my heart beating. But this didn't calm me. Everything coming from my body had a dirty, suspicious air. Most of the time it was silent, remained still, and felt nothing but a kind of heaviness. A filthy presence stuck to me. I had the impression of being tied to a huge worm. At one point, I felt my pants and found they were wet. I didn't know if they were wet with sweat or urine, but for precaution, I went to urinate on the pile of coal. The Belgian took out his watch and looked at it. "It's 3:30, he said. It must have been intentional. Tom jumped up. We still hadn't realized that time was passing. The night surrounded us like a formless dark mass. I didn't remember when it had started. Little Juan began to scream, wringing his hands, pleading, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die." He ran all over the basement, raising his arms in the air. Then he collapsed onto one of the mattresses and sobbed. Tom looked at him with heavy eyes and didn't even want to comfort him. In reality, it wasn't worth it. The boy made more noise than we did, but it was less serious. He was like a sick person defending himself against his illness with fever, even when there wasn't any fever. It was more serious. He cried, and I could see perfectly that he felt sorry for himself. He didn't think about death for even a second. For a single second, I also had the desire to cry for pity for myself. But what happened was the opposite. I glanced at the little boy, saw his thin, sobbing back, and felt inhumane. I couldn't have pity for either others or myself. I told myself I wanted to die courageously. Tom got up and stood just below the round opening, waiting for dawn. But above all, since the doctor had told us the hour, I felt time slipping away, flowing drop by drop. It was still dark when I heard Tom's voice. "Do you hear them?" "Yes, some guys are marching through the courtyard. They're coming to mess with us. However, they can't shoot at night." After a moment, we heard nothing more. I said to Tom, "There's the day." Pedro got up yawning and went to turn off the lamp. He said to his companion, "Cold as hell." The basement was completely grey. We heard distant explosions. "They're starting," I said to Tom. "They must be doing that in the back courtyard." Tom asked the doctor for a cigarette, but I didn't want one. I didn't want cigarettes or alcohol from that moment on. The shots didn't stop. "Do you realize?" said Tom. He wanted to add something, but he fell silent. He looked at the door. The door opened and a sub-lieutenant entered with 4 soldiers. Tom dropped his cigarette. "Steb." "Tom." It wasn't Pedro who pointed him out. "Juan Mirabal, is that you on the mattress?" "Get up," said the sub-lieutenant. Juan didn't move. 2 soldiers grabbed him by the armpits and lifted him, but as soon as they let go, he fell back down. The soldiers hesitated. "He's not the first one to feel bad," said the sub-lieutenant. "Just take him between you two, you'll manage." Then he turned to Tom. "Come on, let's go." Tom went out between 2 soldiers. 2 others followed, carrying the boy by the armpits and by the back of his knees. When I tried to leave, the sub-lieutenant stopped me. "You, Ibieta?" "Yes." "Wait here. They'll come for you immediately." The Belgian and the 2 guards left too. I was left alone. I didn't understand what was happening, but I would have preferred them to finish quickly. I heard the gunfire at almost regular intervals. I shuddered at each one. I wanted to howl and tear out my hair, but I clenched my teeth and shoved my hands in my pockets because I wanted to remain calm. After an hour, they came to get me and led me to the first floor to a small room that smelled of cigarettes and whose smell seemed suffocating to me. There were 2 officers sitting in armchairs, smoking, with some papers on their laps. "Your name is Ibieta? Yes? Where is Ramon Gris?" "I don't know." The one interrogating me was short and stout, with hard eyes behind his glasses. He told me to flex my biceps with all my strength. He wasn't doing it to hurt me, it was his main tactic. He also thought it necessary to send me his rotten breath right in my face. We stayed like that for a moment. I felt more like laughing. It takes much more to intimidate a man who is about to die. That didn't matter. He violently rejected me and sat down, saying, "It's your life against his. Your life will be spared if you tell us where he is." These 2 guys, adorned with their whips and boots, were also men who would die, a little later than I would, but not much. They were busy searching for names on their little slips of paper, chasing after other men to imprison or eliminate them. They had opinions about the future of Spain and other topics. Their petty activities seemed shocking and absurd to me. I couldn't put myself in their place. They seemed crazy. The short, fat one was always looking at me, cracking his whip against his boots. All his gestures were calculated to give him the appearance of a wild and ferocious beast. Then I understood. "I don't know where Gris is," I replied. "I thought he was in Madrid." The other officer lazily raised his pale hand. This indolence was also calculated. I could see all their little maneuvers, and I was amazed that there were men who could have fun with this. "You have 15 minutes to think," he said slowly. "Take him to the storeroom. Bring him back in 15 minutes. If he continues to deny it, he will be executed immediately." They knew what they were doing. I had spent the night waiting. Then they made me wait another hour in the basement while they shot Tom and Juan, and now they were locking me in the storeroom. They must have prepared the blow since the previous evening. They would tell each other that in the long run, nerves wear out, and they expected to take me down. They were mistaken. In the storeroom, I sat on a stool because I felt very weak and started to reflect, but not on their proposal. Naturally, I knew where Gris was. He was hiding at a cousin's house 4 kilometers away. I also knew that I wouldn't reveal his hiding place unless they tortured me, but they didn't seem to be thinking of that at all. All of this was perfectly in order. It was definitive, and it didn't interest me in the slightest. I only wanted to understand the reasons for my behavior. I would rather die than betray Gris. Why? I didn't care about Ramon Gris anymore. My friendship for him had died a little before dawn, just like my love for Concha, just like my desire to live. I still respected him, that was strong, but that was no reason for me to accept dying in his place. His life had no more value than mine. No life had value. They were going to place a man against a wall and shoot him until he burst. Whether it was me or Gris or someone else, it was all the same. I knew very well that he was more useful than I was to the cause of Spain, but I didn't give a damn about Spain or anarchism. Nothing mattered to me anymore. And yet I was there. I could save my skin by betraying Gris, and I refused to do it. I found it quite comical. It was obstinacy, I thought. One must be stubborn, and a strange joy flooded me. They came to get me and brought me before the 2 officers. A rat scurried under our feet, and that amused me. I turned to one of the phalangists and said, "Did you see the rat?" He didn't respond. He was gloomy, taking it seriously. I felt like laughing, but I held back, fearing I wouldn't be able to stop if I started. The phalangist had a mustache. I still told him, "They should cut your mustache off, dog." I found it strange that he allowed hair to invade his face during his life. He kicked me with little conviction, and I fell silent. "Well," said the fat officer, "have you thought it over?" I watched them with curiosity, like insects of a very rare species. I told them I know where he is. He's hiding in the cemetery, in a crypt, or in the gravedigger's shed. It was meant to play a trick on them. I wanted to see them spring into action, tighten their belts, and give orders in an agitated manner. They jumped up. "Let's go, Molly. Go get 15 men from Sub-Lieutenant Lopez. As for you," the fat one said to me, "if you told the truth, I only have one word for you, but you will pay dearly if you fooled us." They left with a lot of noise, and I waited calmly under the guard of the phalangists. I smiled from time to time, thinking about the look on their faces. I felt dulled and malicious. I imagined them lifting the stones from the graves, opening each crypt door one by one. I pictured the situation as if I were another, that stubborn prisoner trying to be a hero, those serious phalangists with their mustaches and uniformed men running among the graves. It was an irresistible comic effect. After about half an hour, the short fat one returned alone. I thought he was coming to give the order to execute me. The others must have stayed in the cemetery. The officer looked at me. He didn't seem upset at all. "Take him to the big courtyard with the others," he said. "When the military operations are finished, an ordinary tribunal will decide your fate." I thought I hadn't understood. I asked him, "So you're not going to shoot me for now?" "No, that doesn't concern me." I still didn't understand. I said, "But why?" He shrugged without answering, and the soldiers took me to the big courtyard. There were about 100 prisoners, women, children, and some old men. I began to walk around the central lawn, dazed. At noon, we were fed in the refectory. 2 or 3 guys addressed me. I must have known them, but I didn't respond. I didn't even know where I was. By evening, a dozen new prisoners were thrown into the courtyard. I recognized the baker Garcia. He said to me, "Damn lucky. I didn't think I'd see you alive again." "They sentenced me to death," I said, "and then they changed their minds." "I don't know why I was arrested 2 hours ago," Garcia said. "Why?" Garcia didn't deal with politics. "I don't know," he said. "They arrest everyone who doesn't think like them." He lowered his voice. "They caught Grizz." I started to tremble. When this morning I had done something foolish, he left his cousin on Tuesday because they had some words. There were plenty of guys who wanted to hide him, but he didn't want to owe anything to anyone, he said. "I would have hidden in Ivetta's house, but since they caught him, I'll go hide in the cemetery." "In the cemetery?" "Yes, he was an idiot, of course. They passed by there this morning. It had to happen. They found him in the gravedigger's shed, caught him and shot him. Everything started spinning, and I found myself sitting on the ground, laughing so hard that tears filled my eyes.